super excited to talk about this fatty acid that I'm not at all familiar with. And you are one of the leading global experts on C15, pentadecanoic acid. And you've published a lot of really interesting research supporting the idea that it is an essential fat in humans. But it's it's completely, I would say, under-discussed. And so, unpack this for us.
Yeah, also it's going to be fun.
Yeah.
So
I'm excited because, I've heard of, obviously I'm very familiar with omega-3 fatty acids, with omega-6 fatty acids. So this idea that there's somehow a new essential fatty acid that's just been not on our radar. I mean, that's quite a claim.
Yeah, well, you're going to help with that today here. So C15 is an odd chain saturated fatty acid, and we discovered at Max unexpectedly. This whole discovery was an accident. And I'm a veterinary epidemiologist, and I was working at the Navy helping Navy dolphins who were living older to understand their health, of helping them live even longer and healthier. And over time, we were seeing that as large brain, long-lived mammals, that dolphins age a lot like us. So as they get, in the wild, Navy dolphins live to like 20 years old, and then Max in the Navy, they're living, from like 40 to 50 and even 60 years old. So as that was happening, we were seeing that some of the dolphins were developing conditions that sound pretty familiar. So high cholesterol, chronic inflammation, fatty liver disease, even an insulin resistance, even the full suite of changes in the brain consistent with Alzheimer's. Wow. Right. So as this was happening, what was really interesting is that we were seeing that some of the dolphins, but not all, were developing these aging-associated conditions, and we used metabolomics to look at thousands of small molecules present in their blood in their all-fish diet. And lo and behold, we actually thought that omega-3s were going to predict the healthiest aging dolphins because all they eat are fish. But what rose to the top was C15, which I had never heard of. Pentadecanoic acid is predicting the healthiest aging dolphins. And
super interesting. I've got so many questions. First of all, what's the Navy doing with dolphins?
Yeah, so the program's been around for 60 years. It's in the process of retirement. So they've had a sustained population of about 100 bottlenose dolphins. They leverage what dolphins do really well, so they can find underwater objects, enemy swimmers. They help find them, tag them, and then off they go, and human counterparts come in and take care of the rest.
Whoa.
It's pretty amazing.
So
Yeah.
are you a dolphin expert, essentially?
In dolphin physiology. Yeah.
Wow. There's dolphins are the only mammal other than humans, or the only animal other than humans, to have sex for pleasure. I've heard.
Apparently you are also a dolphin expert.
Am I? Is that true, or is that just like a
It's
myth?
Whether or not there are other species that might meet that criteria, I think but you're correct.
The jury's still out.
Yeah,
Interesting. Okay, so what is this essential, or what is this fatty acid? And we'll get into whether or not it's essential. You've published the hypothesis that it is. What is this doing in our cells?
Right. So once we found that discovery, which was just association, right, in dolphins, higher C15, healthier aging dolphins, we then moved pure C15 into the lab, and we spent 3 years doing 8 studies. All of this was funded by Office of Naval Research to find nutrients that could improve Navy dolphin health. So, I mean, again, this was like this ended up being a spin-out benefit to humans, but all started for the Navy's investment in the dolphins' welfare. So we did this work. When we first had this hypothesis, Max, we were told, this seems kind of crazy. C15's been around since the 1950s. We've known about it. How is it that you're going to discover anything new about this fatty acid? So they said, go talk to Dr. Ed Dennis. And so Ed Dennis was the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Lipid Research for 15 years. Luckily, he was in San Diego, where we are, so we were able to just drive up to La Jolla and talk to Ed. And we went into his office, and we shared our hypothesis that it's beneficial and active. And Ed's like, yeah, highly unlikely. He goes, we're all fatty acid experts, and if none of us caught it, it's probably not true, but the dolphin angle is interesting. So here are the studies you want to do to kind of play it out. So that then led to these 8 studies. that we did. And at the end of it, it was a paper we published in Nature Scientific Reports. And we showed not only was C15 an active and beneficial saturated fatty acid, but when we pulled all the data together, we sat with Dr. Dennis, and he's like, this is meeting the criteria of essential fatty acids. And so he's the senior author on the paper. And we said, let's put it out there and show all the evidence supporting its role. So,
and what does essential mean? That without getting it from the diet, you develop a deficiency disease?
Yeah, well, that was pretty good.
That was good.
Yeah, I'm done. We can stop now.
Well, so what is the deficiency disease then?
Yeah, so that was a question, right? So we didn't know. So what we had defined for it being a essential fatty acid at the time was that it's active, so it had these cell-based benefits with regard to stabilizing the cell membrane, repairing mitochondria, activating PPAR alpha delta, like a lot of these homeostatic kind of functions, right? Which would make sense for an essential fatty acid. We also knew that at the same time we were finding studies in dolphins, higher C15, healthier aging dolphins, ends up these same studies were out there in humans. Higher C15, people are less likely to get type 2 diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver disease. It just all got hidden because the studies were actually about how saturated fats are bad for us. And those studies showed that these even chain saturated fats like C16, C18 higher levels were associated with bad health. And then it's kind of like a PS at the end of the study. It's like, oh, by the way, there's these trace odd chain saturated fatty acids, and they were inversely associated with these diseases, but that's not really why we did the study. But when we started searching, there are now meta-analyses, studies of huge prospective cohort studies repeatedly showing C15, higher C15, better health. So we know that we have that association in people. And then if people have low levels of it, then again, higher risk of these diseases. So we walk through the criteria for essentiality. Our bodies don't make enough of it. It makes some, but it doesn't make enough to meet this level that we need, that we know is 0.2% of cells of fatty acids in our cell membrane need to have C15 in them or they fall apart. And so it met all these. We were able to check off a lot of boxes. The last one standing was, where's the deficiency syndrome? Where's the disease? So that's what we just published in Metabolites, the journal, about a month ago. It's pretty hot off the press, of what we're calling cellular fragility syndrome. And it's really a culmination of 10 years of studies that we've done and others now around the world. And there are over 100 papers on understanding C15's benefits from all over the world. So we're not alone anymore. And the deficiency syndrome, cellular fragility syndrome, is just like it sounds. Our cells need a certain amount of the stable, healthy fatty acid in our cell membrane to prevent lipid peroxidation, like rancidity of fats, because it's highly resistant to fats. It keeps the cells stable, and by doing that, it's actually a trick that evolution has used for tens of millions of years to enable longevity. So dolphins revealed something that evolution had figured out a long time ago, stable. C15 stabilizes our cell membranes. It actually helps explain how humans live longer than mice. It was just waiting. It's been there in front of us. We just needed the right perspective from a dolphin.
Now, how has the medical establishment accepted this as a diagnosis? What's cellular fragility? What is it? Cellular
fragility syndrome. So this is hot off the press, right? So just like when in 2020 we came out with the essential fatty acid paper, it's not like we got a lot of pushback. It was just more like, well, let's keep watching the data come in. And what's happened is all these studies that come out just continue, Max, to support the hypothesis, and nothing is detracting from it. So what's important is with regard to the cellular fragility syndrome, we haven't received pushback, and we're putting ourselves out there. So we're going to conferences, and we're presenting. Dr. Nick Shork, he is head of the NIH's Longevity Consortium. He was just at ARDD in Copenhagen. So the aging research and drug discovery meeting is like one of the largest healthy aging conferences, longevity conferences in the world. It's for all the highly funded folks. People are getting billions of dollars to try to figure out how to achieve immortality. So Nick was there, and Nick has seen everything under the sun. He got connected with us, and he's like, C15 has better data than any other longevity molecule I've seen when you take in the culmination of epidemiological, cell-based, receptor-based, the deficiency syndrome. And so Nick went and he presented the whole package to this community, which is the toughest community. And Nick is like, a lot of people going, this is super curious, I want to work with C15. Not getting a lot of pushback. There's just, when you start looking at the data, it's hard to explain away.
So what are the symptoms of cellular fragility syndrome?
So this is going to sound corny, right? But it's accelerated aging. So what happens is our cells become more fragile. This is how we age. So a big component of aging is lipid peroxidation of the fats in our cell membranes, right? And so as that happens, it's part of our aging process. We're more susceptible to this peroxidation as we get older. So it kind of feeds on itself, right? So the symptoms are more like things that you would see when you go to the doctor. So it's going to be changes that increase susceptibilities to chronic aging associated diseases. Things like insulin resistance, fatty liver disease, high cholesterol, and heart disease. So a lot of these things, as you know, you don't know you have them in those early stages until you go to the doctor and you get your blood test back. It does, the core and the heart of this cellular fragility syndrome is a method of cell death called ferroptosis. And this was a whole new method of cell death that was discovered by the scientists at Columbia University back in 2012. And, when we went to cell health, like cell biology class, right? There are like 3 ways that our cells die. And that was it. And they discovered in 2012 a 4th new way that our cells were dying. And they're like, it's weird. And the way they described it was the cell membranes have fragile fats in them. They undergo lipid peroxidation. There's a strange iron showing up inside the cell. The iron combines with lipid peroxidation, results in massive reactive oxygen species, takes out the mitochondria, and you're looking at a cell under the microscope that's completely intact. The nucleus looks great, but the mitochondria are all dead, and there's little iron bodies in them. And they're like, what is going on? Since then, there have been over 10,000 peer-reviewed papers on ferroptosis, but nobody has understood where the heck it came from. And so that's where, with our paper Metabolites, we show at the same time we were discovering this same phenomenon in dolphins. In 2012, we published a paper, not knowing it was given a name. And over the past 10, 15, 12 years now, this path it's all come together, where it's deficiencies in C15 makes the cells fragile and then sets off the whole downstream ferroptosis, which then accelerates aging and onset of diseases.
So how would you compare the mechanism of action of C15 to an antioxidant like astaxanthin, which I'm a huge fan of, integrates into spans the cellular membrane and essentially protects against this process, right?
Right.
Lipid peroxidation.
Yeah, so it has a similar role. Its role plays a couple of, it does stabilize the cell membranes in an evolutionary way. A good way to think about essential nutrients are the things that a lot of them are in milk, right? Because it's like, if you think about what every mammal gets at birth, it's got to be the perfect food, at least until you wean off of mom, right? And so C15, our primary source of it is from milk fat. And so this is a nutrient that, again, every mammal gets from birth, unless you get infant formula, which doesn't have C15, so that's a whole other conversation. So it does have this antioxidant property of being the stable fatty acid. It's a pleiotropic molecule, so it's promiscuous. It does a lot of things. Like we talked about, it repairs mitochondrial function.
Never thought of a molecule as being promiscuous.
You brought up sex and dolphins right off the bat there. Yeah. So promiscuous molecule. So it gets around, right?
It gets around.
Yeah, it gets around. And nature's really good at taking essential fatty acids, in which now there's only 3, right? Prior to C15, there were only 2. and making sure that these molecules do a lot of heavy lifting. They do a lot of things. So we now know that C15 not only preserves and protects the cell membrane, but it also repairs mitochondrial function. It activates PPAR alpha delta and AMPK. It inhibits mTOR, JAK-STAT, and what am I missing? HDAC6. So when you combine all of these things, it's a combination of anti-cancer, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic, and even antimicrobial, which interestingly matches the same kind of toolkit of rapamycin. So that was a whole nother study that we did with Nick. But so it's just surprising, continuing to surprise us. And Max, like I get, as soon as there's a new study coming out about C15, I get notified probably every 2 to 3 weeks now.
So you didn't, I guess, discover the molecule, but you were the first to publish on the idea that this molecule might actually be essential for human health.
Yeah, and beneficial. It was really written off the poor little molecule. It was, seen as either the reason why we didn't know about it before. There are a couple of reasons. One is that C15, because it's so reliably present at low levels in our blood, it was actually used as a biomarker to help read all the other fatty acids. So it's actually meant to be like the reference fatty acids. So it was automatically excluded from all of these huge studies before like the 1990s. So it wasn't even allowed to be a contender to be evaluated for benefits until, and even today, there are a lot of fatty acid studies. It kills me because I'm like, oh, great, another fatty acid study on this. How did C15 do? And they're like, oh, C15 was the reference. And I'm just like, oh, so so anyway, it's timing has been fortunate with regard to understanding now its benefits, and now it's unlocked, and whew.
It's fascinating. And so where is this found most, where is this typically found in the food supply? You mentioned dairy.
Yeah, so for us, by far, it's dairy fat. So it's such a good measure, or such a good source of our C15, that studies for a long time have actually used C15 as a biomarker of how much dairy fat we eat.
Interesting.
So, and it's pretty good at it. Like C15 is a pretty good reflection of how much whole dairy fat that you eat.
Yeah. There have been a number of like really interesting and I guess to some paradoxical observational studies that have looked at various cardiometabolic health markers and then related them to whether they consume full-fat dairy, reduced-fat dairy, or fat-free dairy. And I think what surprised everybody in the nutrition community once these studies started to come out is that it's not the fat-free and the reduced-fat dairy that's associated with better health. It's full-fat dairy that's associated with better health. Do you think that this molecule, is at play?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and we've been able to, now that we've been able to parse out, right? So it's like take full fat, and then now let's take C15 on its own and be able to, there was a group, Bishop et al., who actually put C15 head-to-head against whole dairy fat in a mouse model of fatty liver disease. And it showed that C15 had all of these benefits that were repeated that were shown before. And full-fat dairy in that model actually did some damage. So it had some pro-inflammatory effects in this fatty liver disease model. So it's just this C15, it's present, only 1% of dairy fat is C15. So it's tiny amounts, but just our bodies have learned how to make use of this really small amount. So what's really encouraging about it is just understanding that we have nutritional deficiencies that we outline in our papers, less than 0.2%. We've been able to document, you take a cell and it has less than 0.2% of C15 among all fatty acids, it gets fragile. So it falls apart, and the whole pathway of ferroptosis happens. This is what happened in dolphins, that we're able to repeat it in the lab, and it was fixed when you give them C15 back.
Wow. So,
so understanding where do we go from here to fix C15 deficiencies, saying, understand about 1 in 3 people have C15 levels that are at this 0.2% and below.
So it's a relatively tiny amount of this fat.
It's fixable.
Seemingly. It's a fixable problem. So does that mean that butter is back? Is butter a health food?
It's a trick question. So I don't avoid butter in any way, shape, or form. I think we're just talking about steak before this. So I don't avoid. I'm not afraid of fats. But I think there is, there was a group that got together, Thorning et al. They have this great paper in 2017, and they got together in Denmark. And the question was, dairy fat, is it good? Is it bad for us? Is it neutral, or is it good for us? Because the studies are kind of all over the place, right? And like you said, it starts cleaning up once you get to whole fat dairy. And so a lot of mess is because they don't necessarily differentiate between non-fat, medium and whole fat. But what they concluded is that there are specific ingredients within milk that can do better on their own when given in isolation versus when they're mixed with all these other fatty acids. And in general, it's better to get your nutrients from food. And I think kids and growing children, young adults, probably should get back to drinking milk, whole fat milk if you can, and butter and dairy. I do think it needs to come back. Think it needs to not be actively told to avoid our USDA, recommendations. I think you might have just been chatting about things like this.
Possibly at the Senate,
right?
Yeah.
The USDA recommendations has 164 pages in it. They mention saturated fats as something to avoid 161 times.
Wow.
And they don't talk about the odd chain fatty acids at all, despite the fact that there are over 100 papers that are repeatedly and consistently showing the same thing, that C15 is a positive and beneficial and now essential fatty acid. So it's like we need the conversation to get going. It's just we have these blinders up, of all saturated fats are bad. Milk and butter are bad for us, and we just need to revisit the data and the science and just have a conversation about it.
Well, why do you think saturated fat continues to be demonized? There was actually a paper that came out, a month ago, that looked at the top sources of added sugar and saturated fat in the American diet. And the top sources of saturated fat were all dairy fat.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
red meat, which most people will point a finger to as being a dietary villain, one of the major sources of saturated fat in the diet, in actuality only accounts for 3%
I didn't know
of the saturated fat in the American diet. Yeah, unprocessed red meat, excluding mixed dishes. So like a mixed dish, you might think of like lasagna or a burrito or even pizza, something like that.
Right.
But unprocessed red meat. So we're talking like steak.
Right.
Outside of the context of a mixed dish, only accounts for 3% of the saturated fat in the standard American diet.
I just learned that.
And yet it is so often made to be the dietary villain. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So our primary source is from dairy fat. And so again, I think we need to figure out how to get this balance. And so can we get to, so other things that have been happening in the dairy fat front is that industry changes. So we know that cows that are fed that eat grass create milk that has twice as much C15 in it than cows that are fed corn.
Interesting.
Yeah, so there are things like, and even there are studies showing that the altitude of the grass that they eat influences their C15. So the higher altitude the grass a ruminant eats, the higher their C15 levels, even among the grass eaters. So it means that and it's statistically significant. And so it means that when we are eating our whole fat foods, we don't necessarily know anymore how much C15 is in it. So it means that there's room, and it could help explain kind of the messiness of studies of really understanding how can we maximize the amount of C15 present in that dairy fat so that it could help override or be able to better compete against the other fats in there. There's still a pretty compelling science explanation or science evidence for even chain saturated fatty acids. They are pro-inflammatory in the lab. How does that translate? How much does that translate? In real life, I think we're still finding out. And we know that our bodies can make these even chain saturated fatty acids. So our higher levels of even chain impart not just from the food, but we have a disease state, and that disease state is resulting in increased production of these even chain fats. So I think the jury's still out.
Higher carbohydrate diets increase production of saturated fat.
There you go. Yeah.
Like blood levels of saturated fat, which are clinically never measured. I don't think there's much utility for it, but they increase in response to carbohydrate feeding.
Yeah. So it's exactly telling you that. So it's like, okay, an unhealthy state and have you have higher saturated fatty acid levels. So, and specifically, specifically these even chain. The reason why C15 didn't fall into that camp is because we don't readily make enough C15. So it didn't show up in that profile. So that's where still figuring out where the even chains play. Is it because we produce more of it in an unhealthy state, or is it a combination of eating these even chain saturated fats too?
Interesting. Okay, so grass-fed dairy has higher levels.
Double.
Yeah. Wow. Does organic farming versus conventional farming, does that have an impact?
There was a study done in pregnant women in which it showed that pregnant women who preferred organic foods had higher C15 levels. That's the biggest study I've seen with regard to organic foods. There are some encouraging studies from Sardinia. Got to get the longevity blue zone conversation right in. Blue zones are kind of a scam, but yes. So
point taken. I mean, no, they're obviously healthy populations.
So healthy populations. Yeah. So in Sardinia, and this is where men are most likely to live to 100 and beyond, more so than anywhere else in the world. And it looks like they're able to do so because they're less likely to die specifically of heart disease. So when you look at their C15 levels of people in Sardinia, again, the average person in the U.S. and most of the world is about 2.2%. In Sardinia, they're 0.6%. So they've got 3 times higher C15 levels. And so the question is, what are they doing? And what they've done is they have replaced meat with cheese. So they have meat maybe once a week on Sundays and special occasions, but the Sardinian population, that's this high longevity zone, is in a high altitude mountainous area. They have their local sheep and goats that graze on the mountainous grass, and they make a cheese, Pecorino, which is remarkably high in C15. Pecorino.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't have any stock in Pecorino, but I tell you, that's the cheese of choice. So that does mean that, so they're able to get to these, what we're calling kind of like longevity zone C15 levels through the diet, but it's they basically have all the right conditions to set them up for a successful use of C15 from the foods. There was a separate study that came from Harvard and a bunch of other collaborators. It was this large prospective cohort study, and they showed that people who followed over long periods of time, people who have C15 levels between 0.4 and 0.6 were the least likely to develop cardiovascular disease. So maybe there's something there of getting higher levels and being able to support, longevity and longer life.
Yeah. Do different mammals produce it in their milk at higher levels? Like, is goat milk richer in it? Do we know?
There are studies that do compare them. Goats come out on top. You're seeing me pause. Goats came out on top, but I do think its C15 levels are more influenced by what they're fed.
And goats are not like factory farmed.
Yeah, exactly. That you don't have a lot of corn-fed goats out there, so they tend to be used to help clean up and graze. So I think you could take a cow and feed it a goat's diet, and that goat's milk will probably be
comparable. Interesting.
That would be my guess.
What populations are most at risk of C15 deficiency?
So vegans, it's kind of like a B12 situation, right? Where it's like our primary source of B12 is from meat and animal products. So if you are avoiding animal products, and then specifically here dairy fat, you will be C15 deficient. Our gut microbes can make some C15, which is super cool. So when you eat fiber has inulin in it. As a great study showed, they sleuthed out the whole thing, but they showed that if by eating fiber improved fatty liver disease in this model. And then they're like, okay, so then it's specifically the inulin in the fiber that led to better, healthier livers. So then they said, okay, the inulin then is used by this specific bacterium to make C15. And in the end, it was the C15 that it produced that led to these benefits. So there is a path of grains, leading to, specifically fiber, leading to increased C15 production. It's just that it's just not enough. So there's nobody who has zero C15, right? Because our bodies are making some amount of it. So vegans, highest risk. The problem that I hinted at before, which are we've got babies now. So if mom is C15 deficient, her milk will have less C15 in it. A whole really cool group of collection of studies from a completely different group have been looking at C15 levels and in mom's milk and baby's development, and showing that the higher the C15 mom has and that baby gets, the better the growth of that infant, the better the cognitive development. There's a study in France showing that they increase that the children's cognitive development continues to be better through age 6, which is what they're at now with this study. So we talked about infant formula has no C15 in it. And then generations, as we've moved from, I'm 52.
Well, wait, what if it's a milk-based formula?
If it's a milk-based formula, it should, but the studies to date that have measured C15 in formula, and they didn't differentiate, Max, they didn't differentiate readily what was in those formulas, but they didn't specifically say, let's choose non-dairy. Ones had negligible C15 in it. So it's a good question, though, as far as dairy-based.
Yeah, I wonder. I discovered Serenity Kids, which is a great brand of children's toddler formula. I think it could also be used as infant formula, although they don't market it as such. But it's based on dairy. It's based on grass-fed.
That's good.
A2 dairy, I want to say, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, so this product likely will have a fatty acid analysis somewhere, published somewhere, so we could go look up those C15 levels. Yeah, so it looks like babies need about 100 milligrams of C15 per day in order to support this growth. And there's vast diversity. If you look at Asian countries, women tend to be right at that cliff point of 0.2% of C15. Australians have the higher levels. They have like 0.3, 0.4, but they also eat grass-fed. There's a lot of grass-fed milk and dairy products out there, so probably a population with higher. So vegans, babies that aren't getting the proper C15 source. And then now we're seeing increasing generations have moved not only away from whole fat, they're just moving away from cow's milk altogether, right? It's like
for no reason.
Yeah, so like let's go oat and let's go almond, and those have no C15 in them. So the problem
they're trading the C15 for the seed oils.
Yeah. And so USDA has this report they came out with, and it's just kind of like, you just have to, the whole report is like there's a concerning decrease, complete drop off of generation by generation of generations drinking any cow's milk at all. And they said this is very concerning, and it is going to be difficult to reverse. And it's just kind of like, well, it kind of all got started in 1977 when Congress, came out and said stop all saturated fatty acids for all Americans.
Yeah.
And specifically stop drinking whole fat milk and butter and eating butter. That's just translated now to no cow's milk. And that was not their intent. They meant to be like low fat milk and so anyway, it's a problem. And so now that's why the deficiency syndrome, right? The cellular fragility syndrome, present again, based upon extensive studies looking at people's C15 levels, 1 in 3 people have cellular fragility syndrome. And so the urgency for this Max is because if you have 1 in 3 people with a nutritional deficiency, like vitamin D deficiency and rickets and vitamin C deficiency and scurvy, and it's accelerated aging, and it's helping to explain why fatty liver disease showed up in the first place, right, in 1980 and is now present in 1 in 3 people, why there's increased numbers of people with heart disease between 18 and 44 years old, of type 2 diabetes, which used to be called adult onset diabetes, is now present in kids, expected to increase by 637%. So if part of this is just getting C15 back into people's lives, golly.
Yeah.
It seems like we should have a discussion about that.
Well, for people who are regularly eating dairy, I mean, it seems like they are covering their bases.
Yeah.
What about populations who are lactose intolerant, who avoid dairy because they can't digest it?
Exactly. So they're going to be at risk too. So like phase 1 is let's not be deficient. Like let's fix this issue because it's readily fixable and it's safe. If we end up being wrong, like all of the science in the past 10 years and all of these studies end up being wrong, we haven't lost anything, right? It's just things haven't gotten better by taking milk out of children's diets. They've only gotten worse. So it's like, let's deal with that first. And then on the other end, working with the Navy and Office of Naval Research Funding, our science then has been, can we actually leverage C15 and isolate it from dairy fat and leverage it to actually extend our longevity on the back end. So it's kind of like a two-pronged approach of let's go Sardinian. Like how can we get Sardinian and get to those 0.4 to 0.6 levels? But the conversation really needs to start with let's just not be sick, because of deficiencies.
100%. Certain minority populations, like Black people, for example, I know the prevalence of lactose intolerance is much higher, and they seem to be at higher risk for diet-related diseases.
That's right.
Do you think that there's a connection there? Likely.
Yeah, I mean, it's a combination of when Nick presented at the ARDD meeting, he just said it's the preponderance of evidence. He said because he has a good mind in which you can look at cell-based studies, you can look at in vivo studies, you can look at where there's now 2 clinical trials with C15, and then there's all this epidemiological data. He goes, it's just when you put all those different studies together, they're all telling the same story. And he's like, there's just nothing else out there that has this complete and clean of a story. And the urgency behind, again, fixing it for populations that are at the greatest risk.
Yeah, super more. It's so interesting to me that I think the whole notion of nutritionism, where science is a human endeavor and it's an incredible endeavor, and I think from the standpoint of nutrition, we've worked very hard to break food down into its constituent nutrients and identify which nutrients are, optimal and essential for human growth and flourishing. But there's this whole host of other, it's like a relatively unexplored area, these other nutrients in food that you won't find on the nutrition facts label of a food,
right,
but that play a role in human health.
Yeah.
Like I know dairy also has milk fat globule membrane, which has been shown to support cognitive health, cognitive function. And I think it's probably a really beneficial thing from the standpoint of development as well. And so it's interesting that there's this other nutrient hidden in the food matrix.
Right. And
that has benefits.
And that's what, that's a big thing that we're pushing too, because it's a really good point, is that if we could have the dairy producers, product producers, include the amount of C15 in their product, like there will be demand for that. Like if you can show, if I'm looking at 3 different butters to choose from, and I can look at the label and say, oh, this one has the highest C15, I'm going to choose that. And chances are it's also going to be grass-fed. So like you can create demand for being able to, like you're saying, find these ingredients that are strongly science-backed, and be able to bring it to the public and let them drive the demand, because the public's getting pretty science savvy, and and this conversation about nutrition and chronic diseases you were just having in DC.
Oh my God, such an honor, to get to speak at the Senate hearing.
So what were the main takeaways that you got from that whole?
Well, it's just very maddening, the degree of corporate capture that we see at the, both with regards to our regulatory bodies that are really there to help protect the American people, but instead are serving seemingly the industries with which they were tasked to regulate, as opposed to the people who are suffering.
Right.
And that this capture extends up to the top echelons of academia and nutrition science. I mean, it's why we, see studies that come out seeming to claim that food-like products like Fruit Loops and Lucky Charms are healthier than eggs and ground beef, which we saw 2 years ago with the Tufts Food Compass. And so it was a no holds barred, I think, takedown of these structures that seem to be keeping the American public sick.
Yeah. I mean, is it actionable? Yeah.
Well, I think, I think there's only so much politicians can do. I think they can do a lot. But ultimately, I think people have to be more, we need to arm the people with this kind of information.
Right.
Which is where I think podcasting and books and even social media are playing a really empowering role.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, this has been such a great forum for us to get the word out, because we're like, how have I not heard about how could the science get this far? Which, by the way, we put all of the peer-reviewed studies that on C15 at discoverc15.com, so you can go there and nerd out. But how can this level of science be done? And then when we present it at conferences and we bring in people like Ed Dennis and Nick Shork, I mean, these are leaders in these spaces of longevity, fatty acids. Dr. Jeff Schwimmer, one of the world's leading pediatric gastroenterologists, leader in fat. He opened the first fatty liver disease clinic for kids in the world. He was the first to say this is a problem. Jeff actually reached out to me 10 years ago because I had published a paper on fatty liver disease in dolphins. And he's like, he was being polite. He was kind of like Ed, but he's like, it's probably not the same thing. But why don't you send me some dolphin livers that you have in the archive and let me take a look at them? So we sent Jeff these liver tissues, and I'll never forget, he sent an email, and the title was, "We Are a Go." He's like, this is the exact same disease. What is going, because like dolphins don't eat sugar. So what are the commonalities? So over the past 10 years, we've been working independently but parallel, where he's been looking at kids. He published a study showing kids with fatty liver disease, the higher their C15, the inversely associated with the fat in their liver. He just published this clinical trial, randomized placebo-controlled clinical trial, in which these were patients of his that had fatty liver disease. They're now young adults. And they were given C15 supplementation for 12 weeks. And he showed that it successfully raised C15. And among those in which the C15 levels got above that threshold that we need of deficiency, well, first 2 out of 3 were C15 deficient, which was really interesting. And then the next was, of those who got out of that C15 deficiency realm, they had significantly lower, significant decreases in their liver enzymes. So it's all, again, so now we have the leader in liver health and fatty liver disease saying this is something like we could fix. Like, we need to do more studies, but everything has pointed to that C15 deficiencies are playing a part in fatty liver disease, at least specific phenotypes. So it's just, I think it's like you're saying, it's empowering people with science, but it's hard to get that. It's like we can get the leaders, so we started with that, and now it's like,
well, we're trying. How many human clinical trials has C15 been involved in?
The first clinical, so I'd say there's been maybe about 6 clinical trials specifically on C15. The first ones were about pharmacokinetics, and so again, this was we got lucky study in which pharma industry were doing studies on people with cystic fibrosis, and they have decreased absorption of fat because of their intestines have fibrosis, and they don't absorb nutrients as well. So their biomarker of fat absorption was pure C15. So they were able to, they did kids, it was extensive, it was children, it was adults with or without cystic fibrosis. And so these extensive studies that were published over 2 papers, clinical trials, gave us the knowledge we needed of how much C15, of free fatty acid C15 do you need in order to achieve these active levels that were also get you out of the nutritional deficiency zone. So
like how much you need to supplement with in order to pull you out of that zone.
Yeah. And then now we're like, and then go Sardinian, right? So we now know that for every 100 milligrams of pure C15 that you're supplemented with, that you increase your blood levels by about 1 microgram per mil, or 0.1%. Jeff repeated that, which is great, in his clinical trial as well. So that's pretty reliable, which is great, and again, indicative of an essential fatty acid. So those were really pivotal clinical trials. There was one done then in Singapore, in which they gave they had women who had fatty liver disease and or had high BMI. and they gave them a hypocaloric diet. And the second group had a hypocaloric diet that was Mediterranean aligned. And the third was hypocaloric diet, Mediterranean, and C15. And I was just like, oh, come on. I don't think I'm a big believer in C15 and it does great things, but I'm like, weight loss on its own just from having a low calorie diet for 3 months, I was going to do some pretty heavy lifting.
Yeah.
Add in the Mediterranean diet. I'm like, well, interesting. So we didn't even know that this clinical trial was done, and we didn't see it till the paper came out. And lo and behold, they showed that yes, all 3 groups had weight loss. They all had lower liver fat. They all had, if you looked at a trend, but not statistically significant, but if you looked at the trend, it's that third group that had the most weight loss, had the most liver fat loss. But again, grain of salt, because it's not statistically significant. But the third group who had the C15, they also had significantly lower LDL cholesterol above and beyond the other 2 groups, which is like goes against everything we were taught about saturated fats. And it also people had better growth of this beneficial bacterium called Bifidobacterium adolescentis, which is like, I didn't know about this microbe before, but it's a mother of our gut, and is just basically, if you are going to have one bacterium that is in the greatest abundance that helps balance our metabolism and helps keep our whole body balanced, it's this one. So
interesting.
Yeah. So
and
anyway,
increased levels of that.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
What about for people that are consume more dairy fat? Seems to be a good takeaway. Don't be, or at the very least, don't be afraid of it.
Yeah.
But what about for people who are afraid of it because they've been told, and there's certainly some truth to the fact that certain saturated fatty acids will tend to raise LDL cholesterol and ApoB.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons we developed this pure C15 molecule. So all these studies that we've done, that we talked about, Max, are done with this molecule. When we were funded by the Office of Naval Research to develop the supplement for dolphins, again, we started seeing the spin-off benefit in humans and saying, gosh, this is a great way to introduce this nutrient back into people's lives who have a hard time getting there for reasons like you just mentioned, and or people who are looking to optimize. And let's get us to, can we leverage nature and get even beyond where food could take us from a longevity standpoint? There's this theory called the cell membrane pacemaker theory of aging.
I'm actually somewhat familiar with it. Yeah, but unpack it for us. Unpack it for us.
All right. You're the first.
Yeah.
Okay. So A.J. Holbert in Australia, so he came up with the cell membrane pacemaker theory of aging, and he showed that the more stable the fatty acids in the cell membrane, the more stable the cell membrane, the lower the lipid peroxidation throughout the body, the longer a mammalian species lives. So it's and he has this great graph of a mouse on the bottom and like an elephant and people at the top, showing where he was able to demonstrate that association. What we came out with the cell fragility syndrome is pushing the longevity part. So it's the cell membrane stability, right? So can we have the cell stability hypothesis where we can then actually increase the relative amount of C15 through supplementation, start with the food, and then use supplement. The word is supplement, right? It's meant to supplement what's in your diet so that we could further increase and strengthen the cell membrane, so that we could extend longevity not only among different species of mammals, but individuals themselves. And that's where the studies with the Sardinians, the study from Harvard et al., True et al., with regard to these higher levels of C15, lower risk of chronic diseases and these long-lived populations.
Do you think this pacemaker theory of cellular membrane pacemaker theory of aging is where there may be a kernel of truth to the idea that, there are a lot who argue that it's the consumption of polyunsaturated fatty acids, I guess particularly the overconsumption of these kinds of fats, which are when contained within the cell membrane are particularly, I guess, prone to lipid peroxidation. The argument to minimize these in the diet, because you're essentially, the more polyunsaturated fats we consume, right, which today tend to be from these refined, bleached, and deodorized seed oils, which are highly controversial. Yep. That we're essentially enriching our cellular membranes with these fatty acids that are especially vulnerable to lipid peroxidation. And so that's like, I think it like kind of applies a mechanism to that, that dietary concept.
Yeah, and that's really where Holbert was heading with it. He was focused less on saturated fat story of stabilizing the cell membrane. He was focused more on how many double bonds does a fatty acid have. So he was really focused on monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated fatty acids, like exactly what you're speaking to.
So like prioritize monounsaturated fats and reduce your consumption of polyunsaturated fats. You still need omega-3s and omega-6 fats, but past a certain threshold, we certainly shouldn't be like, drowning ourselves in these fats.
Exactly. And that whole theory feeds exactly into, and it's all about balance, right? In the end, it's always about balance. So, but that also feeds right into the ferroptosis discovery. So here, ferroptosis pops up, fragility of cell membranes, and they're specifically saying there are too many polyunsaturated fatty acids in the cell membrane, exactly like what you just said, Max. It's now increasing lipid peroxidation and causing this whole downstream effects of accelerated aging. Why are kids getting diseases of their grandparents before their parents, which is what Jeff Schwimmer is seeing. So it's the PUFAs are absolutely a part of this, an important part of this story. So it's like, again, getting that balance of we need less of the polys. And even as we get older, we might have the same amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids, but we're just more susceptible to those double bonds getting attacked by oxygen and undergoing lipid peroxidation. So as we get older, we have to be more and more careful. Interestingly, our C15 levels naturally go down as we age as well. So it's like, how do we keep that balance between the two? Because you need flexibility, which is what the polyunsaturated fatty acids, you kind of need that, but you need both. And so it's just figuring out how do we get back to having that right balance and then maybe even optimizing it too.
Have you encountered Ray Peat, like the Ray Peat community?
No. So teach me.
He's, I don't actually know that much about him. I know he's a scientist, but he's got legions of devoted fans on social media who promote his dietary philosophy, which is basically that, saturated fats, our diets should be primarily comprised of saturated fats, and we should be minimizing our consumption of polyunsaturated fats, especially these seed oils that everybody's now seemingly talking about, but not just from seed oils, from nuts and seeds, whole nuts and seeds, and even fatty fish. I think he's pushed back to the the idea of that fish oil is beneficial, because mechanistically, it's true that omega-3 fatty acids are more prone to oxidation than even omega-6 fatty acids, which predominate seed oils.
There's some truths in there. As far as, saturated fats, and all saturated fats will help stabilize cell membranes. But again, because the even chains, that C15 ended up, when we did all the studies, we tested all the saturated fats to say, is it really differentiated? And that's where we were able to show that C15 was indeed this Goldilocks fatty acid for all the things that we've talked about in here. But it doesn't mean that there are other sister related fatty acids, saturated fats, that don't have some of the benefits of C15. They just didn't have the whole package. So, and there's evolutionarily, if we look back at dolphins, because you got to bring it back to dolphins, that they used to be land mammals, like large brain land mammals, and they re-entered the ocean about 30 million years ago. Whoa. 13 or 30.
Whoa.
Can't remember. Yeah, kind of cool, right? So that's why when you go to the museums and you see their flippers, like on the side, their fins, that they have fingers, phalanges, right? So that's just left over from when they were on land. And when they were on land, they were probably omnivores. So they probably ate carbs and proteins. When they went into the ocean, they pretty much became carnivores, right? So they went all protein, fat, and no carbs, which is the dolphin's diet today. Because of that, if you give a dolphin carbs, and this was work that was done in the 1970s, they will mimic insulin-resistant person. And, we shared this, we were on Science Friday chatting about it, and that dolphins have evolved to have insulin resistance as a beneficial thing because they don't eat carbs and they have a large brain that needs a lot of sugar. So their bodies need to readily produce its own sugar. But then if you feed that system sugar, then it's, it goes into this hyperglycemic state. The same hypothesis holds for humans during the Ice Age. So when we ate plants and we ate meat, and then we had the Ice Age, and we evolved to basically have insulin resistance because all the plants, all the seeds, everything went away. The carbs went away. We were left with to eat animals. And during that time, we developed insulin resistance as a benefit, just like the dolphins. But then the ice froze, or ice melted, and we came back with like bread and, and all kinds of cookies and things that our bodies were. So insulin resistance is there, and now is obviously a disease state, but it's tapping into these. It's like, ancient evolutionary mechanism.
Protective mechanism. Yeah, it's like why somebody on a ketogenic diet will develop physiologic insulin resistance. Like it's like a healthy, glucose sparing response.
It's just sitting there.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Wow. So, what about with regards to supplementation? Somebody who begins supplementing with C15. Is there anything that they might like feel right away or?
We didn't think so. We thought we always say, go get your labs, go to your doctor, get your labs, take, Fatty 15, take our supplement, 3 to 6 months later, go back and check your labs. And because the thing that Nick loves about C15, Nick Shorg, is like, there are clinically relevant benefits that happen within a meaningful time. Wow. It's not like, hey, longevity drug, cross your fingers, maybe you'll live longer and maybe you won't, but it's like, do I measure my telomeres? Do I look at my epigenetic clock? I mean, Nick is like, it's pretty straightforward with C15. So that was kind of the whole reason of coming out with it, especially with our liver, metabolic, and heart health long term. So then we came out with Fatty 15 in 2021. And we were taking it, Eric, my husband, Navy physician husband, and I were taking it, our friends were taking it. And I'm like, I feel better, but this is like, I'm sleeping better. I used to like wake up on the, like 2:00 every morning, wander the halls, scare my child. Ghost mom, right?
Wow. I'm like, were you sleepwalking?
I wasn't, just like, but
interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, it was unhealthy, right? Circadian rhythm that I had developed, and couldn't shake it. So started taking Fatty 15, and I was sleeping through the night. And I was like, oh, it's got to be placebo. Like something else has happened. It just coincided because that is not what this is not what C15 does. So it ends up there were things that the dolphins couldn't tell us, and that what we learned, and actually the dolphins did teach us, as Fatty 15 was coming out, we were then reliably hearing about half of our customers were feeling better within 2 weeks. And it was the same, like 3 things. It was better sleep, calmer mood, and less joint pain. And so, we were like, because that's not the mechanisms or, anything that we've been talking about. And so we went back to, at the same time, the science has always continued. We will never be done, right? So the science continued. We were looking at other metabolites in the dolphins, right, that were predicting healthy aging. And we had kind of moved forward with Office of Naval Research on the next 5. The one that won that next round of screening was pentadecanoyl carnitine. We'll call it PDC because that's a long word. And PDC it's a metabolite of C15. So our bodies use C15 to make this metabolite. And lo and behold, when we ran it against a bunch of receptors, we published this in Scientific Reports. It is the second ever discovered full acting endocannabinoid. So it fully activates CB1 and CB2 receptors.
Oh, interesting.
Like cannabis, as strongly as cannabis, better sleep, calmer mood, less joint pain.
Wow.
So we think it's these near-term benefits, while we call them delights and surprises, may differ based upon how well people make this metabolite. Because now we're depending not only on your absorption of C15, but now we're also depending on how well your body, your genetics, makes this metabolite. And I was like, it explains all of it. So Jeff's study, he hasn't published it yet, but he did show that when these people took C15, that it had a correlated increase in this metabolite. So a happy molecule.
Wow.
To boot.
Well, I wonder the sleep effects. Like there's always been that folk medicine recommendation to drink like warm milk before bed or something like that. I wonder if you're activating those endocannabinoid receptors with
So smart.
Yeah, with a cup of milk.
Yeah, I think so too. I was telling my mom the same thing. We're like, get your Fatty 15, drink a warm glass of milk. I love it.
So who's the ideal candidate that stands to benefit from C15 supplementation? Somebody's lactose intolerant, vegan.
Yeah, there's who's most likely to be deficient. Those people are likely to report benefits. There's actually a C15. C15 has always been able to be tested through fatty acid panels, as long as your doctor's using a panel that includes C15, right, and doesn't use it as a reference. And then we also worked with Genova Diagnostics to develop an at-home C15 test, just because it's like, if we're saying you need to increase your C15 levels, great stuff. Am I? And where am I at? And so we worked with Genova Diagnostics. So if people wanted to do that, they could test their C15 levels and see where they're at. The other group of people that we see that are fanatics, so we kind of have three groups: the ones that are deficient, the ones that are pretty healthy, but I wouldn't say they eat a lot of dairy. They probably are picking oat milks, but they're not dairy free. Those are the ones that are in their 30s and they see the benefits of calmer mood and better sleep, and it's changing their life. So that's the second group. And then the third group is my favorite, because I'm there because I'm 52. So our older customers, and oh my gosh, Max, like these are hardcore Fatty 15 fans, where if you take away their Fatty 15, I don't know, they might cut my hand off or something. They're like, I have my life back. My knees aren't hurting. I'm back to playing golf again. I'm not napping for 3 hours during the day because I'm sleeping well at night. I have my energy back. It's just the testimonials and the stories we hear back from our oldest folks, because again, if it's helping to strengthen our cells, and I know we have to be careful about phrases like reversing aging, but reversing cellular aging is what it does. 6 hallmarks of aging. Now we're up to 6 hallmarks of aging that it is reversing aging in these folks, and they are feeling it the most. Wow. And so that's been, if we chose who's going to benefit the most, probably the youngest people, because they don't want a lifetime of deficiency riding on them. Who loves it the most?
That's cool to know.
Our older people.
So give us some, I guess, in broad strokes, dietary, guidelines to optimize for this fatty acid in our diets, and then I guess more broadly to optimize around cell membrane stability.
Right. So my preference, based upon the data, is the best source of C15 in food, if you can eat it, is cheese. And it's
Pecorino.
hard cheeses, Pecorino, because you're more likely to get that concentrated. It's like C15 is meant for things to be hardy and survive. Even the Sardinians, because they've been throughout history have been challenged with times of drought and lack of food, and their baseline food supply is based upon doomsday. So all their foods can last without refrigeration, so C15 is really good in those environments. And so it's these hard cheeses are your best source of C15. I have cheese as snacks every day.
Wow.
I have I'm not going to name the brand, but I have a whole grain. So I get my fiber cracker that has 3 ingredients in it and it isn't processed. I have that. To get my inulin and get my microbes making C15. I exercise. If you exercise, you can increase your C15 levels as long as you have C15 in storage, because it releases C15 that's in your tissues, right? So otherwise I would never exercise. I'm just kidding. But it's another good reason to exercise. And then I take Fatty 15. And I think it's because of that combination. I also drink flat whites, so I'm not afraid of milk in my coffees. I have 2 coffees a day, and with all of that, I'm Sardinian, so I have 0.46 levels is the 3rd highest C15 levels.
I want to get my levels tested.
We can get your levels tested.
Yeah, that would be amazing. What about Parmesan cheese?
Parmesan cheese should be good. Let me think through the list. Parmesan cheese would be good. Once you start getting to, like Pecorino's the best. And then you start getting to like the Swiss. And again, you kind of feel like these are harder cheese. The harder the cheese, it seems like the more the C15 in them. So Parmesan's a good one. And then you get to the cream cheeses and sour cream, and it still has C15 in them, and better than like low-fat milk. But you could kind of almost go by the toughness.
Yeah.
How long can you leave it out of the fridge?
Well, also there's like these fantastic Parmesan crisps that are super high in protein.
Yeah, so that could be another source from here.
I love Parmesan because it's like the protein shake of the cheese world. It's like on a per calorie basis, it's got the highest proportion of protein.
You know, I bet it's going to have high C15 because the more I'm thinking about it, because I always think of it as it's Parmesan's already shaped, right? And
I have a block of
right?
Parmesan in my
Yeah,
fridge
it's
right
the
now.
block,
Yeah.
and the block is exactly, it's a hard cheese. Yeah,
Wow.
it's going to have high C15 in it.
You're making a lot of my listeners really happy right now
Well,
because
that's so great.
cheese is one of these, and it's also the top source of. I mean, it is the top source of saturated fat in the standard American diet, which is. I mean, people are eating typically a lot of cheese, but along with that, they tend to be eating a lot of other junk.
Yeah, don't get your cheese because by eating pizza.
Yeah.
Right. So it's really pure, this pure cheese, like whole, pure, clean food. You might know something about that.
Pure Whole Foods. Whole Foods, yeah.
Yeah, I might have a
Yes.
book on it or something.
Might have written a book or two.
Mm.
Well, super interesting. I this is a conversation that I wanted to have because I've seen your guys' marketing, and I've heard of C15. There was a study that came out a couple of years ago where it's considered a biomarker of dairy consumption too. Is it not?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there was like they were looking at this. They were looking at it as a biomarker of dairy consumption, and then associating it with like certain health outcomes.
Dairy fat. Yeah, like it's like, oh, therefore eat dairy products.
Yeah, and I remember in that observational study, I mean, it seemed to be really beneficial.
Yeah. So now we know it's like, oh, it was just perspective, right? It was sitting there all along. It was just saying, oh, it's a biomarker of dairy fat, therefore eat dairy fat. There's something good in dairy. Literally, it would say, therefore, there's something good in dairy fat that's causing this. I was like, no, it's the marker. It's C15. So we were the first to be like, maybe it's not just a biomarker of health, because we were getting it, in the dolphins, it wasn't dairy fat, it was fish. So you have a whole different source for them. And so that enabled us to kind of not have the blinders on and just be like, well, let's just see if C15 is active.
Wouldn't it also be present in meat as well if it's like in grass-fed? If it's in grass-fed milk, I would assume that it would also be like in the meat.
Yeah,
like if we accumulate it in our cells, then eating, the meat from mammals, I would presume would also be a source.
That was a nice series of logic there.
Am I wrong?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's the fat in ruminant meat. So it needs to be ruminants for the most part. So these are animals that have rumens. So and that which we drink their milk is kind of a good way of putting, like goats, sheep, cows. Interestingly, the closest relative for dolphins are cows. And are ruminants. So they're artiodactyls is the group. So they're like cows of the sea.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is really interesting. So with regard to meat, the fat in the meat of these animals have the highest C15, and then even within there, like a study that looked at different types of meat fat, and it showed Australian lamb had the highest C15, grass-fed.
Wow.
And again, we're getting back to that whole, just like you were saying.
Yeah. Well, it's making me feel a lot better about my 100% grass-fed Wagyu beef that I have in my freezer.
Yeah.
That's super fatty, super delicious. But
practically a vegetable.
there's always like a question of like how much animal fat should I be eating? Like a properly raised animal is pretty lean actually, and wild game is pretty lean. So
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, knowing that there is this fat, in the fat of properly raised ruminant animals makes me feel a little bit better about that. It's not just like, empty calories.
Exactly. There's it can help us go back. It's like, again, how can we fix where we were before we had increased prevalence of chronic diseases in younger and younger people? it's when we had a world that was much richer in C15. So how do we get our food supply back to that and then not discourage it in children and infants, and then we can work from there. But it's a good place to start.
Yeah.
I know someone who talks to Congress about things like that.
I mean,
it's great.
So fun. So great. Well, yeah, thanks to you as well, scientists pushing this, the envelope forward and publishing research on it.
Well, thanks. It's been a journey.
Yeah. I mean, you've stumbled on something potentially, that is really cool and potentially has the capacity to do a lot of good for a lot of people. So,
oh, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for doing what you do.
Simon and Schuster reached out last summer because we have a weekly blog where we share C15 science, like what's the latest. And they reached out last summer and they said, hey, this is a great story because we did a TED Talk a few years ago on the origin, so that's fun. And then Simon Schuster said, you should write a book. Like, this is a great story, like a science story. And so wrote that. And so it's on pre-sale, but it'll come out in March, right before 2025, right before National Dolphin Day.
Dope. That's exciting.
Yeah.
And what's the future hold for the research? Like, are you looking to do more clinical trials?
Yes. And explore. So we're moving to the brain. So understanding what are potential mechanisms of action that could be relevant for brain health, because it is way understudied and so important. None of us are untouched by chronic diseases and aging with the brain. So looking at that, and then clinical trials, absolutely extending those, starting with how do we preserve red blood cells health, which we didn't talk about it, but leads to the whole reason why we have iron deposition and iron overload and that part of the ferroptosis puzzle. That if, as we get older, our red blood cells get weaker. We have multiple studies that and including the latest clinical trial with Jeff Schwimmer, that some red blood cells became more stable. So this is, again, such an easy way to fix something. A lot of people who are older have anemia. It increases your risk of frailty and falls and all kinds of things. So it's such a low-hanging fruit of doing clinical trials for C15 for multiple aging-associated conditions, but really leaning on, let's start with anemia, because you get it in the cells, within 1 to 3 months, cells stabilize, no more anemia.
Dope. Well, I consume dairy, but I'm looking forward to trying Fatty 15. So thanks again for coming out. Where can people go to learn more, connect with you, try it if they so choose?
Yeah, you can go to fatty15.com. That's probably shocking. Name of a website. So to learn about the supplement and all that fun stuff there. There's also a link to the test in there. So if people want to get their test done, there's a code. So they could get a discount on the test because it's Genova who does it, not us. And then, like I said, all of the science on peer-reviewed science on C15 is at discoverc15.com, and it's just getting bigger and bigger every week. So it's exciting. We're no longer alone in the arena. We have the world working on this, talking about it, and that was really our job, Max, is just to get C15 to this point to where we could affect change.
So cool. I mean, in an ideal world, like obviously people have different dietary preferences, and there's lactose intolerance, there's people have adopted these predominantly these plant-based diets. I mean, in an ideal world, you'd be getting all of your C15 from food, essentially, right?
Since Sardinians can do it, it means it's possible.
Yeah.
So in the meantime, and that was, Fatty 15 in the supplement was really made to help, again, literally be the word supplement, so that what is needed, that could be tailored for as much as a person needs to meet their needs above and beyond what the diet is, where the diet is getting them. So the diet is always going to be a part of it and always should be the base. But then it's like, how can we use the supplement to move on? And which is why for the dolphins, unfortunately, they're not able to find fish in the ocean that have C15 levels that they used to, because the waters are warmer, the fish are less fat. And there are even fish that used to have higher C15 levels now, Max, have shockingly low C15. So the Navy dolphins are getting Fatty 15, and so they just started a few months ago of formally supplementing the dolphins with Fatty 15. And so we say this is a dolphin supplement in which no humans were harmed.
A dolphin? Wow. That's so cool. I love dolphins.
I know.
Well, super interesting. Thanks for coming out, Stephanie. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been fun, Max.
Yeah, so fun. One last question for you. Are you on social media, by the way? Can people...
Oh, I'm 52. Does that answer your question?
I don't know. I mean, I
have a LinkedIn
and older
because I'm a scientist and I'm on LinkedIn.
You're probably better off. Social media is a weird place.
I'm looking over at my husband. Yeah. Yeah, we're working on that.
Okay, cool. Well, you've laid out the website and your research is out there. So yeah, I guess if people want to learn more, there are plenty of resources.
Oh, and I will say and then there's if you go to fatty15.com, you can sign up for the newsletter. And that's where every Sunday, that's for me. So
That's from you.
Yep. So I help share whatever. So if you want to be further inundated with C15 science every week, there you go.
I love it. Well, last question. What does living a genius life mean to you?
Oh, I think it's about finding your why and fighting hard to stay with it. That is a genius life. It's hard. Like I don't see the genius life as an easy life.
No, it's not.
But I see it as a purposeful and meaningful one, which to me is living. So that's not that I'm talking about experience.
No,
but
I'm sure you are.
If you don't fight for things, right? For us, it was following the data. It's just like the data continued to point, even though it went against everything we've been taught. And I'm a lowly dolphin veterinarian, right? Veterinary epidemiologist. We sought out the experts. We did the work. We got funding. And it just kept saying the same thing. And so it was just a matter of like, hey, we're just going to stay in the arena because this is what the data are showing. Just, despite we knew the battle that was going to be in front of us.
Yeah.
And it's, thank goodness. And it was all by accident. So.
Well, it's always worth it. Nothing worth accomplishing is ever easy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not the genius, but I'm sure glad that genius dolphins were there to help us all out.
Me as well. Thanks for coming out. Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.